In today's video, we're going to look at the contribution of Dr. Dewi Evans to the BBC Panorama programme that was broadcast fairly recently. Even for Dr. Evans, his performance on this programme was fairly remarkable. So we're going to go into that in some depth today. So without further ado, this is Judith Morris, for the people that don't know, who was one of the presenters of the Panorama programme. Here she is kind of sitting there with her usual semi-constipated expression. And she said about Dr. Evans, "This is the man Letby supporters blame the prosecution's main expert witness." Now, I would immediately... This programme showed enormous, very clear signs of bias, but I would immediately say that phrase in itself indicates bias. You know, it's trying to say that it's categorising people that are concerned about this issue in a way that is inaccurate and unfair. I'm not a supporter of Lucy Letby. I don't know Lucy Letby. I've never even interacted with Lucy Letby. I may never interact with Lucy Letby in my entire life. I'm not a supporter of her, you know, as if I'm some sort of fan of Lucy Letby, like a football team. Obviously, I think what's happened to her is horrendous, and I feel a great deal of sympathy and empathy for her as a human being. I'm more concerned about this very obvious and egregious miscarriage of justice and the consequences for not just the healthcare system, not just the criminal justice system, literally British society. That is my concern. That is my primary concern. And I believe that although many people that follow this case do feel a lot of sympathy and empathy for Lucy, and I'm one of those people, I think most people would agree with me that it's not about Lucy. Obviously, Lucy has suffered enormously, and that's terrible, and it needs to be rectified as soon as possible. But we're not Letby supporters. We're just people that are concerned about truth and justice and the safety of the criminal justice system. To characterise us in this way as being Letby supporters shows a deliberate degree of bias in my view. So here's Dr. Evans in the documentary, and he says right at the start, "I read a piece in The Guardian about Cheshire Police investigating a number of baby deaths in Chester Hospital." So that's interesting immediately because this already contradicts something he said previously. So the article to which he's referring is headlined "Police Investigating Baby Deaths at Council Chester Hospital," published on the 18th of May 2017. So when Dr. Evans was interviewed in the immediate aftermath of the court case by Raj Paso, at a time when he thought he was going to be a big hero and no one was ever going to criticise a word that he said, just as had happened previously in the family courts. So he said, "So I read in the Sunday paper," so we know immediately that that's a lie. That's just an outright lie because he's now said it's in The Guardian. This article was published on a Wednesday, so that's an immediate lie. That there were concerns about a number of deaths of babies, and I think the report said actually in Chester that the police had been called in. So I had an email regarding another case to the NCA, and I said, "By the way, I've read about this case in Chester where there are concerns regarding babies dying," and it was an off-the-cuff remark, and I said, "This sounds like my kind of case." So in this video, we're going to demonstrate that this is a completely untrue version of events. So we now know that because of what he said in this BBC Panorama. Now, I would suggest to you, I don't know this for certain, that he has gone back and specifically now explicitly looked at when this was first reported, the investigation of Cheshire Police, which was in The Guardian. They obviously have leaked this to The Guardian. I'm going to go over the timeline in this video as well, but they've obviously leaked it to The Guardian very soon after the investigation begun. The Guardian obviously don't know at this point what is going to happen, and they don't know what they know now. So I believe Dr. Evans has, for Panorama, specifically gone back and looked for news articles so that he can, quote unquote, get his story straight. I don't know that for certain, but this is the first time he's mentioned The Guardian, and as you can see here, This was immediately after the court case when it should be fresh in his mind. So he kind of says, "Oh, what he's saying here is, there I was, casually at the breakfast table reading the Sunday paper, and I just happened to see this." But it was hardly in any newspaper, so that claim immediately seemed to be dubious. But now, of course, he's changed his story. But don't worry, because he changes his story a lot of times on a lot of different things. So Dr. Evans is really a classic example. You could hardly get a better example of an unreliable narrator. In literature, an unreliable narrator is used deliberately for various reasons, sometimes satirical reasons, but in this case, it's not used for that purpose. Dr. Evans is just a narrator of these events that cannot be relied on, because almost any time that you investigate anything that he tells you about anything, it either turns out to be inaccurate, unfounded, or just outright untrue. So I think Dr. Evans believes that, I don't know what he thinks, to be honest, but he seems to think that he's living in the world of microfilm, where people used to just look at newspapers in the library, and the kind of timeline of something, or the kind of detail that you can piece together regarding a topic now, because of the internet, because of things being online, because of Google, and now because of AI, nothing goes into a memory hole now, whereas in the past, everything used to go into a memory hole. So I think sometimes Dr. Evans, and also I think a contributing factor for him is that he's been in the family court and things are just not as publicised there. So he did just go in, do whatever he wanted. There was no consequences. Then he went on to the next case. And even cases that were overturned. There was a case in Northern Ireland that's overturned where he made remarks that were very strongly criticised by a judge. The case where Lord Justice Jackson writes to Goss, the Letby trial judge, and says that his contribution is worthless, he made no effort to give a balanced opinion. That wasn't the first time he'd been criticised for that. It's just the most prominent example. And I think in addition to that, he also thinks, or seems to think, that he's living in a world where he can just say something to the press that he's probably done historically. A lot of people have uncovered and highlighted his comment about, child sex abusers don't really realise that they're doing anything wrong, so we should just decriminalise it. Which I can understand the argument that some paedophiles or some child abusers are ill, essentially, is the argument he's trying to make. But as usual, he spouted his mouth off without thinking the consequences. If you decriminalise child sex abuse, you just give carte blanche the opportunity for people to abuse children. And then they can say, oh, well, I didn't realise I was doing anything wrong. As usual, he just comes up with an idea, he thinks he's right, and then he starts shooting his mouth off about it without even thinking about the consequences. And I think in his head, he's some great intellect. He believes he's some great intellect, but really he's a person of very modest ability. And we see that in the way that he speaks and the way that he expresses himself and the way that he communicates. He's a person of no great verbal ability and no great intellectual ability, whose ideas are not very well thought out. Another example was the Welsh economy stuff that I highlighted previously. I'm sure I could sit down with him and show him all the stuff about the wealth economy, and he wouldn't change his opinion the slightest. But we may revisit that at some point, so I won't go over that too much at this point in time. But I think he still thinks I can just go to a newspaper, or I can go to any, he's been to the BBC a few times. I can just say something, and then people will see, they'll gain a superficial impression of it, and it'll just disappear. He doesn't seem to understand that's not how the internet works. If you say something, it's there forever. So all these times where he is lying, we now know that he's lying on numerous occasions, and saying these things are inaccurate that he then later contradicts. He seems to think, oh, no one will ever know. I'll just put in a little PR statement here, a little PR statement there, and no one will ever pick me up on anything. And actually, the lack of preparation that he did for this panorama, I believe he's gone back and found the Guardian article so he can claim that he saw it in the Guardian, which he probably did. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether this version of events is true or whether the version he gave about seeing it in the Sunday paper, whether he believed that was true. Clearly, he didn't see it in the Sunday paper, so he must have been lying. It's realistic to say that he was lying, but it's possible he didn't see it in the Guardian. We don't know, because he changes his story so many times and he tells so many lies that it's very, very difficult to know what is the truth. But what we can say is the story about seeing it in the Sunday paper is not true. So I want to take you back now to the time when this was all occurring. So this is the Guardian article that kind of announces the police investigation. And because of what Dr. Evans has said in this documentary, we can now piece together a full timeline of everything that occurred. And I want to go into this in a little bit of detail. So we see here, this is the 18th of May 2017 in The Guardian. Cheshire Police have launched an investigation into an unusually high rate of baby deaths and collapses at the County Chester Hospital over a 12-month period. And then DCS Nigel Wenham says here, Cheshire Constabulary has launched an investigation which will focus on the deaths of 8 babies that occurred between that period where medical practitioners have expressed concern. In addition, the investigation will also conduct a review of a further 7 baby deaths and 6 non-fatal collapses during the same period. So we're going to go back now to a meeting that took place on the 12th of May 2017. This is just 6 days before we see this in The Guardian. This is a meeting between 3 executives from the County Chester Hospital and Cheshire Police. Nigel Wenham is present, I believe. And I don't think Paul Hughes is at this meeting. I think it might be Darren Martland, but we'll see as the document continues. So there has been some interaction at this point between Dr. Jairam and the police. And Tony Chambers states that there's nothing new in the email review from Dr. Jairam that's not already been shared with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health and all the inquiries that have gone on. It reads in a fairly unbalanced way and it needs to be looked at in the context of all the information that the Council of Chester can share with Cheshire Constabulary. It is disappointing that it does feel that as a group of clinicians they have not moved on despite all of the reviews and inquiries that have been completed. The concerns appear to be less the details of their allegations, but more the feeling that they have not been listened to and not had the opportunity to have an inquiry and assertive interview with an independent body. The motivation held for writing to the Chief Constable was to state these are all the inquiries that have been conducted and there are still some unanswered questions. So I'm going to continue with this meeting and go through this in detail so you can see exactly what was said at this meeting on the 12th of May. Because bear in mind, I can't say this with absolute certainty, but it is very likely that the 3 executives at this meeting were Tony Chambers, Ian Harvey, and I forget the name of the third person. Is it Pace, his surname? It's very likely that these 3 people are currently facing criminal charges, having been arrested. Admittedly, they haven't been charged yet, and I don't think that will happen because it would be farcical, but nothing would surprise me at this point. So Tony Chambers shares the same concerns as DM, which I believe is Darren Martland, regarding putting the families through a process that feels unnecessary. Tony Chambers would be uncomfortable to pause at this point, but equally would be comfortable to see what level of inquiry could be done that would not necessitate an open, transparent conversation with the families. So Darren Martland has said, look, we can't put the families through a process of where we're going to really upset them, which they obviously did ultimately in the long run, because we don't have any evidence. We're going to see later again in this video the statement on the 5th of May where they say there's no evidence. So naturally the police are being cautious, rightly so. So Ian Harvey added that the content and tone of Jairam's email with the assertion that they have not been listened to hints a lack of trust with the executive team. The 2 leads for both paediatrics and neonatologists are aware they've met with Cheshire Constabulary and that there is going to be potential for an investigation. At no point have the County of Chester uncovered anything that would indicate a significant chance that there was an underlying criminal act, but the clinicians still feel it is unexplained. Darren Martland replied that Cheshire Constabulary have similar concerns. So the key thing here is that the County of Chester executives are saying, look, there's no basis for saying that there's a criminal act here. Even though at this point, the County of Chester have already written to the police on the 2nd of May. We're going to highlight this letter later in this video, saying, will you exclude unnatural causes? But now the executives are in a meeting with the Cheshire Police and they're saying, look, we've got absolutely no indication that there's been a criminal act. We've got absolutely no evidence that there's a criminal act. And the Cheshire Constabulary are saying, we feel the same way. If an objective third-party view is taken, we have clinicians who are experts in their field and other reviews conducted, and at this stage there is no direct allegation of any wrongdoing on the part of an individual or significant negligence, which could potentially constitute a criminal offence. There is nothing to suggest this is the case. So bear in mind, we're sitting here on the 12th of May and there is nothing to suggest that a criminal offence has been committed at this point. Now, we already know on the 18th of May, just 6 days later, Nigel Wenham, who is in this meeting, is telling The Guardian, we're going to do a criminal investigation. So you're going to see why that changed in this video. And we're going to go over all of the details because we now have a full timeline of exactly what occurred in May. So finally it says here, Darren Martland will be guided by the County Chester on where we go next. Cheshire Constabulary can do nothing if the County Chester are satisfied with everything that has been done so far, or if the County Chester is not comfortable and would like a criminal investigation, as there are reasonable grounds for potentially criminal offence has been committed. Sometimes I'm stumbling over these words because they can't write a sentence grammatically correctly, but hey. Darren Martland added that resourcing or media reputation is not the issue for conducting an investigation, it is more how it will affect the families. So I do think this particular statement, and I accept fully that the police have a duty of care towards the families, that's undeniable, but I do believe, having seen the Operation Hummingbird, what they describe as a documentary and what I describe as a promotional film for Cheshire Constabulary, I do believe that they became too emotionally involved with the families, and we're already seeing the seeds and the germination of this idea here. This is already they're thinking, oh, we can't upset the families, which is fair enough. Of course they can't, and I accept that. But I think they became far too emotionally involved with the families, and they almost treat the families as a customer, which was never their job. Their job was to dispassionately investigate what occurred on the neonatal unit and in a forensic, scientific manner. Now, they probably to this day still believe that they've done that. Of course, they have massively failed to do that. So the next bit is that Ian Harvey agrees with Darren Martland regarding the families. This is tragic, most of which have come to terms with what has happened to their babies. I mean, this is such a tragic, enormously calamitous situation. Obviously, on this channel, we tend to focus on Lucy and the miscarriage of justice aspect of it, which is understandable. That's the theme of the channel. But the parents of the infants have just been put through a horrendous experience for no reason, and we don't even know if any of them even know it yet. It's just awful. You know, I wish this had never happened. It's just a calamitous series of failings. I wish this was part of some elaborate, ornate, beautifully written piece of literature that I was reading, and it was just fiction. But sadly, all this actually happened. So they're both sitting there agreeing, well, we don't want to put the families through hell for no reason, but the reason's about to come. So Darren Martland outlined the primary concerns, establishing the facts, welfare of the families of deceased babies. Now, imagine sitting in this meeting. If you'd have said to Darren Martland, you're going to arrest these executives for, gross criminal manslaughter or whatever it's called, that would have seemed impossible at this stage. You can't actually believe that that's been allowed to happen, but now the police are in full self-defence, batten down the hatches. We've got to do what we can to protect ourselves. I consider that despicable, but you know, it's been done before and it'll probably happen again. It's very, very sad reflection on the institutions of Britain, but there you go. So this is SC. So I'm not sure. I think this is the third executive, whose name escapes me. It's worth bearing in mind the report that from Dr. J. Ram had been sent 11 months on. If the clinicians had such a concern, they have been advised from the beginning to contact the police. Of course, this has been mentioned so many times. So the doctors, the consultants on the unit who have been hailed as heroes, if they were actual whistleblowers, they would have done what whistleblowers do, which is either immediately go to the police, as is suggested here, or another thing that they could have done was go to the Care Quality Commission, for example. Now, in my book, I've emailed an expert on whistleblowing who works with real whistleblowers all the time, and she said categorically they're not whistleblowers. So they could have contacted the police 11 months prior to this. It would have gone to the police. Dewi may never have seen the report, and they would have said there's no evidence, case closed, and that would have been it. I wouldn't be here. You never would have heard my voice. That would have been a blessing for you. And Lucy Letby, we wouldn't even know her name. This would have just been a small but regrettable episode in her life, and she would have gone back onto the neonatal unit, and she would have been a nurse, and then hopefully they would have got things right. There'd be a level 1 unit. It just would have been, wow, do you remember that horrible time when I got taken off the unit? And they probably would have rebuilt their working relationships, and they would be what they are now and what they should have been, which is a functional level 1 unit. And that could have happened, and it didn't happen. So let's continue. Tony Chambers stated that there have been 13 babies die, but at what point did the only reasonable explanation link to a single nurse? When there is a death, there is an M&M review with the organisation. Some of this will be recorded accurately. The Council of Chester spoke to the general managers asking if it felt uncomfortable. They went back to the clinical team asking if there is anything to be worried about, any problems with the environment, staffing levels, etc. The feedback that the general managers received was that everything was fine. So this very much feeds into this, in my view, I use the word despicable again, despicable arrest of the executives who have done nothing wrong. They've been extremely responsible in a very delicate situation where they have to take the concerns of the consultants seriously, and they have to protect Lucy Letby and ensure that she is treated as fairly as possible. Now, obviously, you can argue, and I believe this myself, that she wasn't treated fairly. She was taken off the unit for no reason. She was put through a traumatic experience, and I believe if she'd gone for wrongful dismissal, she would have got it. Of course, there are enormous consequences in going for wrongful dismissal. It's not easy to do. So it's very, very sad what's happened here. Not just to Lucy, but the executives are currently sitting there now. They've been arrested. They've been interviewed. They just think they're literally in the position Lucy was in after her first arrest of what's going to happen? Are they going to arrest me again? Am I going to be charged? Am I going to go to prison even? The executives can't be 100% certain at this point that they won't go to prison. I'm pretty damn certain they won't. And if they are charged, I will help the defence. Because I know everything that happened in that hospital. I read every single document. I know it inside out. And the only reason I haven't put it on this channel is because there are legal concerns and various other issues that are related to Lucy's outlook and prospects. If those two things were an issue, I already would put it on the channel. But if the executives are charged, which I don't believe will happen, but if they are, I will help their defence, no doubt. So we'll move on. Darren Martland clarified that there was nothing new that has come out of the email that Council Chester were not already aware of, and nothing contained in an email that makes specific allegations which could cause Council Chester to believe that potential criminal offences have been committed. Tony Chambers and Ian Harvey both agreed, excuse me, there was nothing to suggest this and nothing new within the email. Ian Harvey noted that the clinicians had their own separate section with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health Reviewers. So we've seen that now. I don't know that we've seen the outcome of that session, but we've seen the report and we've seen the acknowledgements from the RCPCH reviewers that the clinicians were concerned. So I'm going to speak about that in my next video. And in that, they raised concerns about the individual. This was not in the RCPCH TOR terms of reference, as they considered this an HR issue, but the RCPCH did produce separate observations outside the report in which they called out the paediatrician's concerns. RCPCH stated that the allegations were based on nothing more than coincidence and good feeling. There was nothing definitive. So again, we're seeing exactly the same thing. We're going to see this again in police documents. It's just a coincidence. There's no evidence. I think this should say gut feeling, by the way, not good feeling. I just noticed that. So there's some great typing and great writing going on in this document. But yeah, that should say gut feeling. So the takeaway from this really, so the RCPCH report does reference this, but had the executives referred this case to the police more quickly, for which there was no justification based on the RCPCH review and based on the statement of the police here, but had the executives done that 11 months earlier, as was suggested earlier, there's absolutely no doubt there would have been no investigation. In fact, it's possible or perhaps even probable that Dr. Evans wouldn't see it, wouldn't hear about it, and as I mentioned earlier, this would just never would have occurred. So again, this is another sad aspect of this, but as you can see, everything is just pointing towards there's no evidence whatsoever. So let's hold that in our minds and continue. So this is the actual statement. This is from a different meeting, 5th of May. This is the very initial meeting of Operation Hummingbird, where the police conclude there is no evidence other than coincidence. This is some 11 months after this. The RCPCH review concludes there's nothing more than coincidence and gut feeling. 11 months later, there's still no evidence other than coincidence. So the idea that the police have arrested the executives, I believe it's these three executives. It will certainly be Tony Chambers, Ian Harvey. I couldn't say definitively the third executive, but it's very likely to be the third person at this meeting. I can't obviously say that because they haven't released their names, but there's just no conceivable way that they could have done anything else. They involved the RCPCH, they involved the Care Quality Commission, they did internal reviews, they had a grievance procedure for Lucy Letby, they did listen to the consultants, they did listen to their concerns, they repeatedly asked them for evidence, they sought legal advice from external sources, and everything was pointing to the fact that they should never refer this to the police, let alone 11 months earlier. And when it was referred to the police, it was referred with no evidence, as the police acknowledged themselves. So these arrests of the executives are entirely frivolous. There's simply no basis for them whatsoever. They couldn't possibly have done anything differently. They actually handled it, I think, quite admirably in many ways. And if they were charged, it would just be a disgrace, frankly. So we'll move back to the 12th of May meeting. So this is with the three executives. So it's noted here that the Council of Chester exhausted all lines possible, and there is nothing that could potentially be evidence of a criminal investigation. The concerns raised by the consultants have been raised previously, and there is nothing they are aware of that would consider or believe that potential criminal offences may have been committed. Tony Chambers stated a meeting had been held on the 11th of May with Council of Chester executives, and it was felt that the explanations of what has happened do not lie in a single place or cause, and certainly not criminal. Concerns from the consultants were also expressed to the RCPCH, as it is referenced in their review, which I've seen that statement and that comment. Ian Harvey added that the Council of Chester are mindful they do not want to use Cheshire Constabulary as an HR process for staff. If you place yourself in the mindset of paediatricians to see what the motivation is, there is a strong sense of personal accountability that a clinician feels, and when there is no clinical explanation, they feel uncomfortable. It is unusual that they have a collective mindset. This is a problem which the Council of Chester need to manage, as it is not a criminal issue. So I wanted to just highlight this point, this sentence about if you place yourself in the mindset of paediatricians to see what the motivation is, there is a strong sense of personal accountability that a clinician feels. When there is no clinical explanation, they feel uncomfortable. So that is a statement from Ian Harvey, who elsewhere, and indeed in the very next sentence, is critical of the consultants. So I do think that his comment here is a fair one. It's a comment that people have disagreed with in the comments section, and I am going to be addressing this in full in my next video. In the RCPCH review, there is a comment about the paediatricians being genuinely concerned about what's occurring on the unit and feeling a sense of responsibility and needing to get to the bottom of it. And I do believe that this was genuine. I do think Lucy Letby was scapegoated. I'm trying not to get into this in too much depth here because I'm going to do a full video about this going into depth. I do absolutely believe she was scapegoated, but I don't think it was done consciously. I don't think they deliberately set out and thought, we will scapegoat Lucy Letby, we will blame her for everything on the unit. I think they had sincere concerns about what was happening and made numerous mistakes. But I will outline this in more depth in my next video. But Ian Harvey essentially shares this view, and he must be very angry at this point, or scared, or bitter. He'll definitely have some feelings because he's been arrested and not charged but accused. Essentially, you shouldn't get arrested for no reason. I believe these arrests essentially are for no reason, but you shouldn't get arrested for no reason. Some very serious allegations have been made about him that have very serious consequences, and yet here he's defending the consultants a little bit, although elsewhere he's critical of them, saying that, their views are sincere. He doesn't believe they're trying to stitch Lucy Letby up, or not consciously and not deliberately. So we'll revisit that topic in the next video, but I just wanted to kind of make that point at this stage. Tony Chambers satisfied that Cheshire Constabulary would determine whether or not there has been any criminal intent. The Council of Chester maintained an open mind and would welcome an inquiry if necessary, but this has never felt the issue. It was felt amongst the executives that it needed to be checked. Darren Martland was clear to Tony Chambers that all Cheshire Constabulary have done to date is look through reviews and reports they have not investigated. There is a need to clarify points made in Dr. Jane Horden's review in relation to the coronial position of the 4 babies in Category 2. So my question would be, Darren Martland is saying that they haven't investigated the reviews and reports, so they need to clarify points made in Dr. Jane Horden's review. So my question would be immediately, why was Dr. Jane Horden's review completely overturned by someone who's significantly less qualified than her, who hadn't seen the infants? Why didn't you actually go directly to Jane Horden, as you could have done? They don't think they'd have a very good answer to that question. If there is no direct allegation or suggestion from Council Chester of any potential criminal wrongdoing, then Darren Martland would be comfortable to put into writing, based on meetings and documentation so far in response to Tony Chambers' letter, that Cheshire Constabulary will not conduct a criminal investigation at this stage, with caveat if further information comes to light. So again, I want you to remember that, because that's going to be important as we continue. Tony Chambers stated it would become a wider GMC issue as there becomes a point where a group of clinicians who are not prepared to take the recommendations of RCPCH are blocking the ability to move forward, which creates a more difficult and dangerous environment for sick babies. So I want to mention as well, something that people may not be aware of, is that the paediatricians threatened their resignation from the unit as collectively. Now, whether they would have actually followed through on that, I don't know. But they said, we're going to look elsewhere for another job in a different region. We're going to all tender our resignations. What are you going to do about it? Which to me is, it's certainly, I was going to say something there, but I won't say that. It's certainly tantamount to a very serious threat, even if it's sincere. Let's just say that. I don't think they would have followed through on that for 1 second. I really don't. I think they were just, it's like throwing all your chips into the table in a game of poker, really. But yeah, Tony Chambers and Ian Harvey are trying to deal with a very delicate situation, a very difficult situation, a very damaging situation for the hospital. And I think all the way they've behaved very fairly to all parties in what was a phenomenally difficult situation. And I think for them to have been arrested and accused of behaving inappropriately is absolutely disgraceful. And that's why I want to take the time to go through this letter, but also because it refers back to Dr. Evans and the statement that he's made right at the start of this interview with Judith Morris. So Tony Chambers added the consultants have made their points. They have been seen and not judged as sufficient to warrant a police-led investigation, looking at how close it constitutes as a criminal act. Constitute to being a criminal act. There was a need to explore to ensure Council Chester have not missed anything, but there is also a need to move on. It will become a GMC issue. Likewise, if the media are involved, this is for the Council Chester to manage appropriately. Darren Martin replied, if the Council Chester position is that they are satisfied where they are and there is nothing of anything that would cause to believe potentially criminal offences have been committed, which may warrant a police investigation, then this needs to be placed in writing to Darren Martland. Darren Martland would respond that based on meetings and discussion at this stage, the police position could be summarised that police investigation will not be led due to these reasons listed. So again, I want you to reflect on the fact that these executives have since been arrested by this police department. Tony Chambers questioned if the email from Dr. Jairam had been sent to Cheshire Constabulary without the conversations held previously. It is one of the assumptions that a conversation would have been held with Dr. Jairam. It appears that until the clinicians have had the opportunity to sit opposite a police officer, they will remain motivated and there is an apparent lack of trust with the Council Chester executive team. The clinicians' view is that Council Chester have not listened, but they have just not agreed. Let's go over that again. The clinicians' view is that Council Chester have not listened, but they have just not agreed. So, essentially, what he's saying there is the executives did listen to the clinicians, but they don't agree with them. So, how on that basis they could claim that they're acknowledging this, the police here. So how this can go in a report, how the police can say there's no evidence, how the police can essentially rubber stamp everything that's said here, but then later arrest these executives, I just cannot even begin to understand. If this is to be the sufficient point to draw the line, dependent upon the rationale for not conducting a police inquiry or criminal investigation, it cannot be on the basis that Count Chester does not feel that it is warranted. It has to be based on Cheshire Constabulary not investigating based on the review's reports. Darren Martland stated the question is whether or not there is a police criminal investigation. Cheshire Constabulary will be guided by the Count of Chester. If there is evidence that could potentially constitute as a criminal offence, then it would be investigated, but the impact of which the families, so that just trails off into a meaningless sentence, but they're obviously talking about the impact on the families. Tony Chambers stated the Count of Chester will have a conversation with clinicians following this meeting to agree those points, and state that based on what has been provided as a clinical team and what is known from the reviews, it does not appear there are any grounds for a criminal investigation. A request will be made for any other information that is being withheld that would help meet the threshold requirements. Councillor Chester can hold this conversation, but why cannot Cheshire Constabulary have this conversation? Tony Chambers queried what the difference is. Darren Martin replied that Cheshire Constabulary are guided by Councillor Chester as the clinical expertise, and that the email sent from Dr. Jerram has not highlighted anything new that Councillor Chester are not already aware of. Councillor Chester need to clarify that they are happy, based on the email from Dr. Jerram, that there were no concerns prior to the email that would potentially warrant a criminal investigation, and has this position changed since the email. NW, this is Nigel Wenham, added an observation that Dr. Jerram has sent the email directly to the police and bypassed the Councillor Chester executive team. So that was... You could criticise that, but really what should have happened is that should have happened 11 months ago. If they felt they weren't being listened to and they felt that there needed to be a police investigation, it either should have been referred to the police a long time before this, or they should have been whistleblowers and gone to, for example, the Council of Chester or the Care Quality Commission. The other thing is that Dr. Jerram, at this point, is supposed to have seen Lucy Letby attempt to murder a baby in the case of Child K. I covered this in previous videos. No doubt I'll do an entire video on Child K, or maybe even a series of videos on it. But he has yet to mention this to anyone. He's about to mention this in a forthcoming meeting with Cheshire Police. Cheshire Constabulary are duty-bound to respond to Dr. Jerram on behalf of the clinician team. It might be appropriate to have a conversation with Dr. Jerram around the content of the letter and gain a feel of anything else that they may wish to disclose, which would add some value to the contents of the letter. Darren Martland reiterated what had been agreed. On part of Cheshire Constabulary, a meeting will be held with Dr. Jerram on the 15th of May, which we're going to be looking at shortly. The meeting will be held with Dr. Jerram only to discuss the contents of the email sent to Cheshire Constabulary to ensure it has been interpreted correctly. It is factually accurate and there is anything of significance that has not been disclosed which is not in the email. If Dr. Jerram does disclose anything which potentially could be evidence of a criminal wrongdoing, then Cheshire Constabulary would have to consider a criminal investigation. Equally, if there was nothing new raised in the email or conversation, then we would look to Councillor Chester to write to Cheshire Constabulary to confirm their position, stating we are not requesting a criminal investigation. Once Cheshire Constabulary has held this meeting with Dr. Jerram, they will then formally report back to Councillor Chester with the outcome, and Cheshire Constabulary will put this in writing to the Council of Chester. An exchange of letters would need to be agreed pending the outcome. So this is all very legalistic, obviously. Tony Chambers agreed that as Dr. Jerram has bypassed the Council of Chester executive team, it is appropriate that he has the opportunity to speak. And when the decision is made to either proceed or not to a full inquiry, it will be based on the whole picture and it will be a stronger position for the Council of Chester. At this point, Tony Chambers would feel more comfortable that the clinician should be able to move on. SC, is the third executive, raised that it could potentially leak that Dr. Jerram is meeting with Cheshire Constabulary, and although there is no police inquiry at present, Council of Chester needs to be mindful of this. Nigel Wenham to arrange a one-to-one meeting with Dr. Jerram on 15th of May 2017 to discuss concerns raised within email sent. So please remember that this is a one-to-one meeting with Dr. Jerram. Darren Martland stated that at present there does not appear to be any evidence of a criminal wrongdoing from the reports and reviews which would warrant a police-led criminal investigation. So it's once again reiterating there's no evidence of any wrongdoing at this point, none whatsoever. They've done reports, they've done reviews, they've done everything that they reasonably could have done. However, Dr. J-Ram has raised some concerns in an email which is believed to have been covered in previous correspondence with the Council of Chester, and we do not believe there is anything new. Correct. However, we will agree to give him the opportunity to raise those concerns with the police as he has sent it directly. So at the moment, this is all perfectly reasonable. And then we have this meeting on the 15th of May. So the first thing to say about this meeting is, remember how it's a one-to-one meeting with Dr. J-Ram? Well, suddenly Dr. Stephen Breary's invited himself. Now, what I will say about Breary and J-Ram is that Breary is definitely the ringleader of what occurred on the unit. He was the driving force behind it, undoubtedly. And I'm not going to get into that in this video. We're going to discuss this in the next video. But the reason that he's the ringleader could be because he's the paediatric lead at the hospital, or it could be because of his personal foibles as an individual. I don't know what the reason is, but he was undoubtedly the person that was driving this from day one. Now, we're not going to go over this meeting because this video will go on forever. But the first thing is, I've been over this in previous videos, and this is the meeting held just 3 days after the meeting we've just gone over in depth, where they make it very clear that they suspect Lucy Letby. They couldn't have, the only way they could have made it clearer was if they actually said, look, Lucy Letby has been doing all this, which they didn't do. But they said nurse, 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 nurse over and over again and identified her quite clearly. The second thing to say about this meeting is Dr. Stephen Breary's not even supposed to be there, but he's obviously invited himself, or Dr. J-Ram's told him, and he said, oh, I'll come along. The third thing to say about this meeting is this is where Dr. J-Ram for the first time mentions the fact that he's supposed to have seen Lucy Letby attempt to murder a baby. This is over 450 days after he saw it. I have been over the details of that recently. As I say, I will make eventually at some point. There's so many videos to make. I'm never going to run out of content for this channel, but I will try and make a series on the Child K incidents because that is just so ridiculous. But I think even I included a section on the retrial in my 200 problems video that I made recently. Even that gets across quite clearly how ridiculous and how unsatisfactory the fact is that Lucy Letby is facing a life sentence over literally nothing. So that's what occurred at this meeting. This is after an email from Dr. J-Ram. This isn't the email on the screen. I'll get into this in a second, but I should say that J-Ram has emailed Nigel Wenham I'm not going to go over that email in this video, but that's on the 10th of May, before the 12th of May meeting that we've just gone over in detail, and then before the 5th of May meeting that he actually has with the police. This is from the 2nd of May, and this is a letter to the Cheshire Constabulary to ask them, as we see right at the end of this letter, I am writing formally requesting that Cheshire Police conduct a forensic investigation into the circumstances surrounding the deaths with a view to excluding any unnatural causes. And boy, did they do a shit job of that. So that was what they were initially asked to do. And when we look at what they actually did, it was so far removed from what they'd been asked to do by the hospital, frankly, it's a joke. And we see here, look, we've had an extensive review. We invited review from the RCPCH. We've had a case review by an independent expert. They've had pathologists as well. No single factor has been identified by these reviews. However, there are 4 cases in which a cause for collapse or death cannot be ascertained, which the independent expert tells us is unusual. I don't think that's even true from the statistics that I've seen. I find it odd, but ultimately, she's entitled to her opinion. She's an expert. But I think the police got very confused in this situation by this notion of unexplained deaths. For them, an unexplained death, automatically they're all in the. I mean, I think I've probably spoken about this before on the channel. I think the psychology of the police, leaving aside other criticisms we might have of the police, they're always in the mind. I think they're infected by the fact that they're just constantly surrounded by crime and criminals. And I think eventually you just have the worldview of everything's a crime, everyone's a criminal. So the fact that also they're not medically qualified. So the fact that a baby's the actual specific cause for collapse or death is not ascertained, and that there's an unknown outcome. It's not as unusual. It may be. It's not. Obviously, it doesn't happen in the majority of cases, but it's something like 8% of all infants die for unknown reasons in this country, and it's really high for neonates. So the police obviously didn't investigate this and don't understand this. And I think they focus, they zoom in on the fact that, as is stated here, the cause for collapse or death wasn't ascertained, so it was unknown. And then they decide that this is suspicious. And as we'll see in the timeline, Dr. Evans doesn't help the situation, to say the least. So because of all this information that we have, and because of what Dr. Evans has said in the BBC Panorama, we can now create a full timeline of what exactly occurred in May. So on the 2nd of May, Tony Chambers wrote to the Cheshire Constabulary asking them to exclude unnatural causes in the letter that we've just seen. On the 5th of May, the Cheshire Constabulary hold their initial meeting of Operation Hummingbird, during which they conclude that there is no evidence other than coincidence. On the 10th of May, Dr. Ravi Jairam sends an email to Nigel Wenham of the Cheshire Constabulary requesting a meeting and expressing concerns. On the 12th of May, a meeting takes place between police and the 3 executives who are likely to be those recently arrested by the Cheshire Constabulary. Cheshire Police indicate that there is no intention to investigate the matter any further. It is also indicated that Cheshire Police will meet with Dr. Jairam in a one-to-one meeting. On the 15th of May, Dr. Stephen Breary turns up with Dr. Jairam despite the fact that it's supposed to be a one-to-one meeting, and they proceed to seed Nigel Wenham and Paul Hughes with a variety of information, much of it misleading, inaccurate, or simply plain wrong. I should also say that they identify Lucy Letby and Dr. Jairam remembers about Charles Kay. I'll also say that in that meeting, Dr. Stephen Breary was very much more forceful with his views than Dr. Jairam. Dr. Jairam was the good cop in that meeting, and Dr. Stephen Breary was the bad cop. On the 18th of May, Dr. Dewi Evans sees the article in The Guardian entitled Police Investigating Baby Deaths at Council Chester Hospital. Previously, he has claimed that this was mentioned to him during an email regarding another case, but it is hard, based on this account, for him to claim that he wasn't proactive in seeking to participate. And then from the 18th of May, I mean, I can imagine this happened very quickly. He probably saw the case and thought, oh, it's another payday for me, and got in touch with them immediately. And I can imagine that he met with the police days after the 18th of May. That's the one thing we don't know, but I can imagine it was very, very soon after that. So in the BBC Panorama, Dr. Evans says the following: "My concerns were pretty rapid. You know, within a matter of minutes, really, it struck me that this baby was a victim of significant inflicted injury and that we were already looking at some kind of criminal event." So within just a matter of minutes, he decided that this was a crime while he was sat in Cheshire Police Station with Cheshire Police. So that, obviously as well, let me just add as well, he's approached them through the National Crime Agency. So previously, Dr. Evans has claimed that, oh, I had no idea that a crime had taken place. Just because I was going to a police station to meet with the police, having been contacted by the National Crime Agency, I went there with a completely open mind. Although now he's telling us that previously he told us it happened within 10 minutes. Here it's within a matter of minutes, which implies that it was less than 10 minutes. So let's just look at what Dr. Evans did that day. So here's Dr. Evans on the road, tootling off in his little car. So it's just a 7-hour round trip. It's 3.5 hours from Carmarthen to Chester in Wales, from Wales to the northwest of England. So it's 3.5 hours. It's a 7-hour round trip. It's approximately 300 miles. So he drives all the way there, and then he decides almost immediately, within a matter of minutes now, he says. It was 10 minutes before, now it's within a matter of minutes. So the timeline is getting shorter. So if he gives another interview, he might say, I decided in the car before I arrived. So I'll leave people to decide whether or not he did decide in the car before he arrived. So he immediately decides that it's a criminal event. So I just checked this with ChatGPT just to get the interpretation of a language model. My view is that the phrase just a few minutes implies less than 10 minutes. So it says here, in that sentence, within a few minutes is being used to convey very quickly, probably just a few minutes. Given the serious and sudden nature of the realisation, the listener would interpret that as somewhere around 2 to 5 minutes. So he's shaving it down from 10 minutes now. So as I say, if he gives another interview, he might actually say, it was so quick, I actually decided in the car park before I even went into the police station. Well, he probably won't be stupid enough to say that, but yeah, we're seeing this is pretty incredible given the context of what occurred. So we'll move on to discuss that context now. So the first thing to say is that Dr. Evans is overruling the coroner immediately. He's overruling Dr. Jane Horden, who is an actual neonatologist, immediately. He's overruling Dr. Joe McPartland, a pathologist, almost immediately. And above and beyond their superior qualifications, he's also overruling people who examined the actual infants, and he's doing this, by his own words, in 2 to 5 minutes. So Mark MacDonald was actually interviewed in this documentary, and he made a statement regarding this, talking about the 10-minute claim that he'd made previously. Of course, he didn't know that Dr. Evans was going to shorten this time period and make it even shorter. So he says he walks into a meeting where he's given a set of notes, he looks at them, and while he's drinking his coffee, within 10 minutes, he knew what the pathologists didn't know, what the treated clinicians didn't know, what a plethora of reviews that had taken place on this hospital didn't know. He knew within 10 minutes while drinking his coffee that this was an unlawful act against this child that led to the death of this child. And as we mentioned, he drove 3.5 hours, 150 miles approximately, to make that decision in what we now believe is 2 to 5 minutes. So I'll leave people to reflect on that. So the next thing Dr. Evans says is, what I discovered was that there were many deaths, 7 of them where there were grounds for thinking they were due to inflicted injury. So essentially there he's just telling us what happened in the court case. Like, we already know that. There was evidence from local nurses, other local doctors and the other independent witnesses, and this led to the conviction, which in my opinion is absolutely safe. So we're going to break that down now, because this was his second statement of some substance in this documentary. So he must have been rehearsing in the mirror, because this was such a rehearsed statement. I mean, it's hard to imagine that there was a direct question that he's answered here, because it doesn't address anything meaningful. So it's just the kind of thing, stick to the story. I can just imagine him looking in the mirror, rehearsing what he was going to say when he arrived, trying to comb his hair over to pretend that he's not bald, and then he, just says things that mean nothing. So firstly, what I will acknowledge is that there can be editing sometimes that makes someone look a bit stupid than they actually are. So we don't know what he said overall, but given that Judith Morritt, this was a very poor attempt to make even a remotely balanced documentary. And we know Judith Morritt is completely committed to guilty. She's made that crystal clear. She made it crystal clear in this documentary. She made it crystal clear in a book. She's made it crystal clear in every public statement she's ever made. So there's nothing... This was an incredibly soft interview, so the idea they're going to stitch Dr. Evans up and use editing to make him look worse than he actually was is very unlikely. So if we actually just break this down before we go into the next thing. The first sentence here is that it's just simply repeating the charges. So, I mean, it tells us nothing. So then he goes on to say, it was not my evidence alone. So I've been over this numerous times, but I'm going to go over it again, just with a small amount of analysis this time. So these are the 6 other people who were expert witnesses in court. Now, I've analysed their contribution in some depth previously. Marna Reedes relied on Dr. Evans' notes. Professor Owen Arthurs didn't support Dr. Evans. Professor Sally Kinsey didn't meaningfully support Dr. Evans, and in fact questioned his ear embolism theory to a certain extent and said that she couldn't really comment on it properly because she doesn't know anything. Professor Hindmarsh was involved in the insulin cases, which are literally nothing to do with Dr. Evans because he doesn't know the first thing about it. Dr. Stivaros wrote a letter, didn't even appear in court, made almost no contribution to the court case whatsoever, let alone did he support Dr. Evans. And that also applies to Dr. Simon Kenny. So we've dealt with the expert witnesses pretty quickly there. Then we'll move on to Dr. Bohin, who did appear in the documentary briefly. So she did possibly the worst peer review in human history, where Dr. Evans just handed over his conclusions to her and she looked at them all and said, I agree with absolutely everything that he said. So that is the quality of independent support that Dr. Evans received during the court case. Let's be clear. This court case was 95% the contrived theories of Dr. Evans. He received almost no support from any other medic, or as he puts it, independent witnesses. He also primed all the independent witnesses by giving them his reports and having a meeting with them before the court case, where he essentially prepared them for what they were supposed to say. I mean, that's just they got together, they had a conflab, and then after that they all came. They gave their bit in the court case. Although most of the independent witnesses didn't support him anyway. The only one that did really was Dr. Bohin, and he already handed over his conclusions to her. So the next thing I'll mention is that he's talking about local nurses and local doctors. So none of these people came up with any of the theories or particularly supported the theories. They were mostly brought in to participate in the circumstantial case and say that they had expected certain infants not to collapse, but that was because they didn't understand what was happening because it was a lousy unit. The local doctors and theories provided no support for the theories that Dr. Evans concocted. He never actually provides any meaningful information about anything, it's just drivel and sound bites, and this is yet another example of this. But we get to move on to the greatest part of this panorama documentary, which is still to come. So, Judith Moritz asked him a question: how is this is regard to Child C, where we've many times noted that Dr. Evans has changed his opinion? How is it possible for other medics to look at the same material and say there's no evidence of deliberate harm? That's a question for them, and it may be that perhaps they don't know as much as they think they do. So let's just assess that for a second. So firstly, just one member of the panel alone is Professor Nina Modi. It's reasonable to describe Professor Nina Modi as the most qualified person in neonatology, the most experienced, the most credentialed, the most high status, experience, highly regarded, all of these things in Britain. We're comparing that to someone who's not even a neonatologist, who hasn't worked in a hospital for nearly 20 years. But perhaps he knows more than Nina Modi. You know, it's possible. This lady has been president of the UK Neonatal Society, president of the Academic Paediatrics Association in Great Britain and Ireland, chair of the British Medical Journal Ethics Committee, and so on, and so on, and so on. So comparing her to Dr. Evans is, I've used this analogy previously, it's like comparing Tiger Woods to a local club professional. So if you go to a golf club, there'll be a local club pro who usually works in the club shop, does a bit of coaching, that kind of thing. And he will be a very, very good golfer. And I'm not diminishing the fact that Dr. Evans is a qualified paediatrician, or was a qualified paediatrician. He's not a paediatrician now, even though the BBC described him as a paediatrician in the documentary. But I'll come back to that later. He's like the equivalent of a tour pro, and then the panel are like the equivalent of Tiger Woods. There's no comparison between the two. They are way, way, way above his level. And for him to say they maybe don't know as much as they think they do is just utterly ridiculous. Truly is embarrassing for him. Truly. So, not only are these... I mean, I've only looked at Nina Modi. Just Nina Modi on her own completely outranks Dr. Evans to an absolutely ridiculous degree. But of course, there are now 14 world-class experts plus 26 experts on the panel. Then there are hundreds of doctors, scientists, statisticians and other relevant professionals who aren't on the panel, who are both very critical of Evans and the science used in court. Then there are probably at least 1,000 nurses that challenge this verdict and court case, including many neonatal nurses. And then, even among the hardcore guilty believers, by this point there probably isn't a single person who will advocate for Dr. Evans. I doubt there is a single person who will come out and say, yes, I think Dr. Evans is a real asset to the prosecution, and I think he gave a very good account of himself during the Panorama documentary. And then, on top of that, there's also Dr. Xu Li, who is literally one of the most important people in the history of neonatology. And he obviously authored the paper on which Dr. Evans exclusively relied on diagnostically for the key contention in the court case. Dr. Xu Li is founder of the Canadian Neonatal Network. As I say, one of the most credentialed neonatologists in the entire history of the specialism. He's the primary author of the paper on which you solely relied for diagnosis of the most important claim in the court case. And he has rubbished what you have done and said you've completely misused the paper and your diagnosis is essentially total nonsense. So to reiterate, we've got 14 world-class and hugely credentialed experts, plus there are now 26 experts on the panel, one of the most important figures in the history of neonatology, who authored the paper on which Evans relied for the most most of the infants in the case, hundreds of doctors, scientists, statisticians and other relevant professionals who aren't on the panel were very critical of both evidence and the science used in court, and probably at least 1,000 nurses that challenged this verdict in court case, including many neonatal nurses. According to Dr. Evans, none of those people know what they're talking about. Now, during the Panorama documentary, Judith Moritz would exhibit this very strange behaviour she has, which is cocking her head to one side slightly in a way that is reminiscent of a dog. Like my dog, she doesn't do it so much now because she's super intelligent and she learns so quickly and she learns words very quickly. But when we were first together, I would say things to her and she'd cock her head to one side trying to understand. But she's so clever, she hardly ever doesn't understand anything that I'm saying to her now. But it's a typical thing that dogs will do, and Moritz will kind of do this. She'll cock her head to one side and have a kind of pained expression on her face. Sometimes she looks like she's constipated. And she basically ends up looking a bit like this. Now, I'm sorry that I understand that obviously what I've done here in literally comparing her to a dog, that could be offensive to some people, so I do apologise. Obviously I love dogs, and I'm really sorry for comparing them to Judith Moritz. But it was a good joke, so I thought I needed to fit it into the video. And anyway, Judith Moritz, despite looking very confused and pained about the whole thing, as she probably sat opposite this gentleman and realised this guy is a complete shyster. I've backed this guy 100%, and this guy is an absolute shyster. Anyway, she made this comment. This changing of position between different possible causes is leading to people arguing that the whole thing is flawed. Can you see that? So Evans, in response to that, says, my opinion was that this baby was a victim of inflicted injury, and whether this was air into the stomach or air into the bloodstream or a combination of both, they all represent deliberate harm. Brilliant comment. So then Moritz says, you can't be certain of which of those two causes. In fact, it was three causes, because he said bloodstream, stomach, or both. Three causes. Does that matter? Does that matter, he says. Well, there are many who say it does. It does not. Both reflect inflicted injury, deliberate harm, in other words, murder. Now, I'd love to know what preparation that Dr. Evans did for this interview. This is prime time, BBC One, 8 p.m. You think he would have prepared something to rely on? He knows people are saying that he's changed his opinion on Child C. I don't know how much he knows about that, but he definitely knows that because he spoke to The Guardian about it. He actually thinks he can just toddle up to a primetime documentary on BBC One and say anything, and the fact that it contradicts his previous public statements doesn't matter, if he can even remember them. He's barely even coherent at this point, so who knows if he can even remember what he said previously. So let's go through the 5 problems with what he said here. Firstly, Dr. Evans has just confirmed that he worked backwards. So he said here, my opinion was that this baby was a victim of inflicted injury. That's not what you do. You don't look at the notes and go, is this inflicted injury or not? Yes, it is. Right, now I'll work backwards and try to work out why it's inflicted injury. Embarrassing, stupid, ridiculous. There are other words I could use. Those are the mildest words that I could use to describe this. Secondly, he previously stated quite explicitly that he didn't change his mind. Now he's saying that it doesn't matter that he's changed his mind because it doesn't make any difference. At this point, he has now quite explicitly contradicted what he said in court. Fourthly, if his so-called diagnosis is based on one or the other, then he does not have a diagnosis. That is quite simply not a diagnosis. And then 5, this particularly applies considering the 2 mechanisms suggested would have different clinical signs, which is precisely why it does matter. Even if that wasn't true, when you go into a court case, you should still have a firm diagnosis. If you're going to make a definitive statement, which he did all the way through the court case, which he always does on every subject matter, but if he's going to say, stand up in the court case and say, this is definitely inflicted injury, he must have a solitary diagnosis on which he can firmly rely. And in order to firmly rely on something, you must be able to eliminate all of the causes. And if you have 2 completely separate mechanisms that have different clinical presentations, you have failed to do this. So we're going to spend a little bit of time to go over the different clinical pictures just so we can make this crystal clear. So as you see here, venous embolism and injection of air into the stomach produce very different clinical pictures because because in one case the air enters the circulation, while in the other it remains in the gastrointestinal tract. Here's the comparison. Air enters the venous system via open veins, IV line, surgery, trauma. The air travels straight to the right heart and pulmonary circulation, impeding blood flow. So I don't know if this description is going to include the existence of frothy blood that I believe occurs in the right ventricle. As stated here, the air travels to the right heart. Often with air embolism, you would get frothy blood in the right ventricle of the heart, and there are documents from the Council of Chester noting this and noting that this frothy blood is not present. Symptoms can appear within seconds to minutes. So then we'll move on to the typical clinical features. So cardiorespiratory signs, sudden dyspnea or tachypnea. One of those means rapidly increased breathing and the other one means shortness of breath. I'll probably get this the wrong way round, but I think it's tachypnea that means shortness of breath, but that's what those two things mean anyway. Chest pain, cyanosis or hypoxia, we've probably encountered these words before. Hypertension, tachycardia, possible cardiovascular collapse. Neurological signs is paradoxical embolisms through a patent foramen ovale, confusions, seizures, focal deficits. Other findings, mill-wheel murmur, churning, splashing sound over the precordium, pulseless electrical activity in severe cases. Compared to ingestion of air into the stomach, air enters the stomach via swallowing, deliberate insufflation or accidental air injection via feeding tubes. Onset depends on volume, usually gradual discomfort unless massive air is introduced quickly. Typical clinical features, abdominal distension, bloating, belching, nausea, vomiting, mild shortness of breath, no cardiovascular collapse, percussion over epigastrium, tympanic note. I don't know what that means, haven't got the slightest clue. So key distinguishing points. Different primary system affected, different onset, different vital signs, different auscultation. Never heard that word before. Sounds like it's something to do with the heart in some capacity. Physical exam is different, danger level is different as well. So you can see from this table, we're looking at just completely different signs for every single aspect of this. So then I asked for a side-by-side timelines of symptom progression. So between 0 and 30 seconds, there'll be a very sudden onset with venous embolism. Dyspnea will be apparent, coughing, blood pressure may drop. Often no immediate symptoms unless massive air bolus. Patient may just feel a brief burp reflex. Another important thing to note about this is, so they're saying here, this is saying here, with a venous air embolism, there's a very swift clinical presentation. Now that does not fit the picture of what we've seen with these infants, where there isn't, sometimes these things are taking place hours after the supposed injection of air, and it just doesn't make any sense. That's why Dr. Evans is going to be thrown out this court case. Eventually, I believe, I can't say this definitively, but even if there was a retrial, I think the prosecution will just choose to take everything he said out of the court case. And I think it would just end up coming down to a few cases. I could easily see them, if they, I mean, you never know because the Crown prosecution is stupid enough to try and take everything on, but we know the statistical case is complete rubbish. So I could see a scenario where if there was a retrial, they just contest child F, child L and child O, for example. And Dr. Evans barely even plays a part in the court case if he's in it at all. And I think that they'll want to ditch him and dump him as quickly as they possibly can. And I think all his embolism stuff will just be gone. But first of all, we have to get to that point because we have to go through the Court of Appeal and so forth. Who knows what's going to happen there? I have been asked a question about this, so I'll try to address that in a future video. 30 to 120 seconds. Hypoxia, tachycardia. Patient may clutch chest or struggle to breathe. May hear mill-wheel murmur over precordium. Gradual feeling of fullness in upper abdomen. Patient may notice discomfort if standing or sitting. 2 to 5 minutes. Hypotension worsens. Confusion or loss of consciousness possible. Seizure if paradoxical embolism to brain. Abdominal distension becomes visible. Belching attempts. Mild shortness of breath if diaphragm is pushed upwards. If unrelated, cardiovascular collapse, pulseness, electrical activity, arrest. More distension, possible pain, respiratory compromise only if extreme. No cyanosis unless secondary to severe diaphragm splinting. Without urgent intervention, death is likely. Gradual relief if belching or nasogastric tube used. Generally resolves without major systemic effects. So the other thing I should say on this is making the assumption that there's a significant amount of air that gets through the venous system. One of the things to mention about venous air embolism is that it's actually very difficult to do that, which is why it's usually aspirated successfully or there's no emergency in the first place. So although, it is potentially life-threatening, there are a lot of things that have to happen before that occurs. So then external physical presentation. Skin colour, as we know, is this cyanosis, blue, hypoxia, pallor from shock, normal, possibly flushed if in distress, facial expression, panic, gasping for air, wide-eyed, clutching chest, obviously babies can't do that, grimacing from bloating discomfort, neck veins may be distended if right heart filling is obstructed, normal, rapid breathing, possible audible splashing, murmur with stethoscope, normal sounds over chest, abdomen, flat, early, no change initially, visible upper abdominal bulge, tympany on percussion, posture may slump or collapse quickly, restless then obtunded, may hunch forward, obviously this isn't going to happen with a child, short gasping phrases or aphonia is severe, can usually talk, may groan from discomfort. And then, there's a bit more here about how they look completely different. The key thing, of course, is, as we know, there's the very different clinical presentation related to the skin that just means they're completely incompatible. But Dr. Evans tried to suggest that there were rashes that were compatible with venous air embolism, and we know that's not true. So we simply know that's not true. But anyway, you cannot possibly sit there and say it doesn't matter whether it's venous air embolism or whether it's air in the stomach. That statement is just completely untenable. In relation to this, even Jonathan Coffey said, air into the stomach and air into the bloodstream are very different things, and to just slide from one theory to the other, I think makes it sound like you don't really know what happened, which is a fair comment, of course. They didn't actually mention that they have different clinical presentations, symptoms, etc., but this was a fair remark. But it's not just the fact that he doesn't know what happened, it's the fact that his methodology for deciding what happened is something that no doctor in the world with any credibility would ever use. So if you go into general practice, and the whole basis of a medical degree and the whole basis of medical training is that you go away to medical school and you learn as much as you can about symptoms, you learn as much as you can about the way the body works, the way the anatomy works. And then, for example, if you were to work in general practice, when you have that initial fact-finding discussion with a patient, you're trying to get as much information out of them as you possibly can so that you can have their symptoms, and then from those symptoms you make a decision, or you make the most likely clinical decision that you possibly can. It can be, there are clinical symptoms that there are many conditions, consistent with many conditions, and there are overlapping considerations, etc. But you try to get as much information as you can. That is to eliminate as many things as you possibly can, and then you make a decision based on that. You don't invite someone into your surgery and then go, oh, I reckon this is an air embolism. No, wait a minute, it's this instead. Oh no, maybe you've just got a headache. Or maybe, actually, you could have cancer. Oh no, you've got poor circulation. It's not what happens. You gather the symptoms first, and then you make a decision on that basis. Dr. Evans has made it very clear in this documentary. My professional opinion was that this was deliberate harm. This was malignant behaviour, right? That's not what happens. And then he says it doesn't matter if one of two things that have completely different clinical presentations is just murder either way. So he makes it clear that he worked backwards from an assumption, which we've all suspected for a long time, but in this documentary he makes that crystal clear with his own words. So we know now he had an immediate assumption that there was malignant harm, and then he just tried to work backwards and fit the symptoms around that. He did the complete opposite of what you should do. What you should do is start with the symptoms and then see what that points to, and if it's one thing only, then you make that diagnosis, and if it's multiple things, then you try to find other ways to eliminate the possibilities. And that is what he claimed to do. He claimed to have done a differential diagnosis. He claimed to have done a diagnosis of exclusion. We now know that he just decided, Lucy Letby's guilty, Lucy Letby's harmed these babies, it's air into the stomach. Oh no, it's air embolism. Hey, it doesn't matter which one of those two things it is. It does matter. It's absolutely fundamental to the entire case. So when I was thinking about the title for this video, I considered calling it Dewi Evans is literally an idiot. Dewi Evans literally has zero credibility. Someone fetch Dewi Evans a shovel. Dewi Evans is more toxic to the prosecution than Chernobyl. Dewi Evans is derided by literally everyone. Dewi Evans seems to think information disappears on the internet. Dewi Evans is still pretending that he's a paediatrician rather than retired. Dewi Evans genuinely believes that his own supporters are morons, and does Dewi Evans even have a 3-digit IQ? But I settled on the actual title for this video, which I'm happy with. Some of those titles, of course, were too long, but I really strongly considered calling it Dewi Evans is literally an idiot. But I decided to go for the one that I chose. And it's been a lot of fun taking the piss out of Dr. Evans in this video, of course, but there is a very serious subject at the heart of this. And the two things that I will say about this gentleman are, firstly, he's a complete and utter shyster. That's the first thing. And the second thing I will say is that he's extremely dangerous. And we've seen in this video and in this case how dangerous he is. And we've seen in previous cases how dangerous he is. And there is no doubt that previous cases that he's worked on should also be investigated. So finally, I do get people who come into the comments section who believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. So I would love people to come into the comments section for this video and agree with any of the three following statements. I'd love people to tell me that they think the theories of Dewi Evans are credible, that they think Dewi Evans is a reliable witness, or that they think Dewi Evans gave a good account of himself on Panorama. If there is literally anyone out there who believes that, then I'd love to hear from them. So if you do believe that any of those three things are even remotely accurate, please do indicate this in the comments section, because as I say, I would love to hear from you. Finally, I just want to mention that I made some comments about the consultants in a previous video, and they might have been slightly flippant, and I might not have expressed myself as well as I intended. When I do those Q&A videos, you're trying to get through as many questions as you can, and I can't give 10 minutes for every question, otherwise they go on forever. So I might not have expressed myself as well as I would like to, or would have liked to. So I'm going to make a video, the next video I'm going to make is going to be on addressing that and explaining my full position and telling you some things that you perhaps don't know. I was going to tack that onto this video, but then there was so much to say about Dr. Evans and the timeline and so on. I wanted to get through all that and make sure it's all in this video. So I'll do a standalone video on the consultants on Monday. And then the plan is to do Panorama tube intubations, Panorama insulin cases, and Panorama child O. And I've got Judith Moritz's book as well. So some of that will be in there as well, particularly for the insulin. However, I'm also planning to do some interviews soon, so I might, if I get one done, then I might sandwich that in there somewhere. But my next video will be on addressing the consultants, and then we'll see what happens after that. But I'd just like to say, again, emphasise, I really appreciate all the support and comments. It's been very enjoyable to read them. Every time I receive comments, I really appreciate it. And I'm doing the best that I can to make the best content that I can, and hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I went in pretty hard on Dr. Evans in this video, but I stand by it. I know everything that I said is 100% factual, so it's not really a problem. Yes, if you have any comments, queries, questions, observations, anything else that you'd like to share, then I'll look forward to reading them.